The flickering shadows of dawn stretched long across the savanna, painting the dusty landscape in hues of amber and rose. But within the quiet confines of a small traditional hut, a different kind of shadow held its vigil. There, etched against the weathered wooden frame of a single window, sat a creature of breathtaking, almost mythical beauty. A leopard. Not just any leopard, though. This one was visibly wounded, a deep, angry gash marring her left flank, her usually sleek coat matted and stained. Yet, despite the obvious pain, her golden eyes, pools of ancient wisdom and raw instinct, were fixed with an unnerving intensity on the interior of the hut. She had been there for days, a silent, enigmatic sentry, her presence a heavy, mysterious weight in the still African air. No one quite understood how she had arrived at this remote village, nestled deep within the heart of the continent, nor why she chose this particular window, this solitary perch, as her sanctuary. She was a ghost of instinct, a living paradox of vulnerability and untamed power. Inside the hut, Sarah, a wildlife conservationist from the United States, stirred from a restless sleep. The muted light filtering through the gaps in the thatch roof did little to dispel the lingering shadows of her own recent failures. Just months prior, a critical anti-poaching mission she had poured her heart and soul into had dissolved into bureaucratic chaos and tragic loss. Disillusionment had settled deep within her, a bitter taste that no amount of pristine wilderness had yet managed to wash away. She had sought refuge in this forgotten corner of Africa, drawn by tales of a community where humans and nature lived in an almost symbiotic dance, hoping to rekindle the dying embers of her purpose. Her own hut, simple and austere, reflected her current state, a temporary shell holding a soul in transit. As she stretched, a familiar, almost subconscious pull drew her gaze towards the window. Her breath hitched, as it always did, at the sight of the leopard. There she was, the magnificent creature, a tapestry of spots and raw power, an apex predator reduced to a silent, suffering observer. The wound on her side seemed to pulse with a silent accusation, reflecting the helplessness Sarah felt. It wasn't the first time the leopard had appeared. It had become an almost daily ritual, a silent, unsettling communion. Each morning, without fail, the leopard would be there, sometimes closer, sometimes nestled further back in the tall grasses, but always within sight of Sarah's window. What struck Sarah most profoundly was the leopard's surprising calmness. There was no aggression in those piercing golden eyes, no menace in the way she held herself. Instead, there was an almost unbearable vulnerability, a quiet desperation that resonated deeply within Sarah's own wounded spirit. The leopard simply observed her, her gaze unblinking, unwavering, as if seeking an answer to a question Sarah herself couldn't articulate. It was a silent conversation, a primal connection forged in the crucible of shared pain, a magnificent beast brought low by an unseen force, turning to a human for what? Help? Solace? Or merely a silent witness to its slow decline? The urgency to act, to intervene, pulsed through Sarah's veins. Every fiber of her being, every instinct honed by years of conservation work, screamed at her to do something. But what? This was not a wounded bird, easily nursed back to health. This was a wild leopard, a creature of immense power and unpredictable nature, whose trust, if it could even be called that, was fleeting and fragile. Yet, she couldn't ignore it. The leopard's silent plea, played out daily outside her window, was a call to action. She found impossible to resist. This extraordinary bond, this unfolding mystery, demanded attention. Don't miss a single moment of this incredible journey. Subscribe now to follow Sarah as she navigates the complexities of her own past, the traditions of a remote African community, and the desperate struggle to save this majestic, wounded leopard. Her story, and the leopard's, is only just beginning. The majestic leopard, a creature of such raw power and exquisite beauty, continued to be a constant, unsettling presence outside Sarah's window. Each sunrise brought the same tableau. The golden eyes fixed on her, the slight dip in its flank where the injury festered, a silent testament to its suffering. Days bled into weeks, and the initial shock gradually gave way to a profound sense of anguish within Sarah. The wound, a ragged tear along its hind leg, seemed to worsen with each passing day, the fur around it matted and inflamed. Yet, the leopard stayed, its gaze unwavering, almost pleading. Sarah, a seasoned conservationist, understood the immutable laws of the wild. Interference was a double-edged sword, often doing more harm than good. But this was different. This wasn't merely an injured animal. It was an enigma, a living paradox that had chosen her window, her hut, as its refuge. A deep, almost spiritual connection began to form, an unspoken dialogue between species. She felt a desperate, visceral need to help, a primeval urge that eclipsed all rational thought about danger or protocol. The inherent risks of approaching a wounded predator, let alone a leopard, were immense, a fact her training screamed at her. Yet her heart whispered a different truth. The village elders, their faces etched with the wisdom of generations in this land, offered solemn warnings. Their dark eyes held a profound respect for nature's delicate balance, a balance Sarah, with her Western ideals of intervention, sometimes struggled to fully grasp. "The wild finds its own path, Sarah," old Jabu had rumbled, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. To meddle too deeply is to invite greater trouble. A predator made too comfortable with man becomes a dangerous beast, for itself and for us. Local guides, hardened men who tracked these formidable creatures for a living, echoed Jabu's sentiments, emphasizing the unpredictable nature of an injured leopard, its capacity for sudden, devastating violence. They understood her concern, a silent sympathy in their eyes, but their counsel was unwavering: respect the wild's course. Isolated by her fervent desire to act, Sarah found herself navigating a lonely path. Late into the night, she would scour her limited satellite internet connection, searching for any local veterinary contacts specializing in large felines, traditional healing methods, anything that offered a glimmer of hope. The futility of her search only deepened her frustration. There simply were no readily available resources for such a specific, dangerous intervention in this remote corner of the world. She considered reaching out to her network back in the US, but the logistical nightmare of flying in a specialized vet and equipment to this isolated village felt insurmountable, especially without local support. Driven by an instinct she couldn't ignore, Sarah began a clandestine campaign of aid. When the village was quiet, the moon a sliver above the acacia trees, she would cautiously leave out a shallow bowl of water near her window, and occasionally a small portion of raw meat she acquired from the local butcher under the guise of feeding a stray dog. The leopard, ever vigilant, would wait until the coast was absolutely clear, its amber eyes scanning the darkness before slowly, deliberately approaching its offering. Each time it drank the water, each time it carefully, almost daintily, consumed the meat, a fragile tendril of hope unfurled in Sarah's chest. It was a minuscule act, a drop in the ocean of its suffering, but it was something. It was a way to acknowledge the unspoken plea in those golden eyes, a silent promise whispered across the threshold of the wild. She knew this was a dangerous game, a blurring of lines that could have dire consequences, but she couldn't turn away. Not from this creature. Not now. The leopard's condition continued its agonizing decline, a stark, painful truth that gnawed at Sarah's soul with each passing day. The wound, once merely a disfigurement, now bloomed with angry redness and a faint, sickly odor that even the constant breeze couldn't entirely dissipate. It began to show clear signs of infection, a systemic weakening that stole its once formidable strength. Its movements, initially a fluid, predatory grace, had become stiff, labored, each shift of its magnificent body an obvious agony. It would lie for hours, unmoving, its head resting heavily on its paws, eyes half closed against the relentless African sun. Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to the window, spending every spare moment observing the ailing creature. Her research, conducted in stolen moments by the flickering light of her oil lamp, offered no easy answers. The more she learned about large cat physiology and common ailments, the more desperate she became. The village elders' warnings, once a gentle chorus of caution, now felt like a suffocating blanket, holding her back from what her instincts screamed was the right thing to do. She risked their disapproval, their quiet judgment, by neglecting her usual duties, by hovering at the window, a silent vigil that spoke volumes of her growing obsession. She wasn't just watching, she was trying to understand, to decipher the unwritten language of its suffering, to find a pattern, a telltale sign that might offer a clue to its resilience or its breaking point. Her internal struggle was a maelstrom. Every fiber of her being, every lesson learned in countless conservation efforts, urged her to act, to intervene, to alleviate the pain. This was precisely her purpose, her calling. Yet, the elders' wisdom resonated too, a powerful counterpoint about the delicate balance of nature, about respecting the wildness of the wild. To interfere, they argued, was to tamper with forces greater than herself, to invite unforeseen consequences. Her past failures in conservation, wounds that still smarted despite the years, amplified her current torment. The memory of the rhinos lost to poachers, the community project that faltered, the trust that had fractured, they all coalesced into a suffocating weight. This leopard, this magnificent suffering creature, represented a chance, perhaps her last, to set things right, to reclaim a piece of the hope she felt she had lost. If she could save this one solitary animal, perhaps she could assuage the gnawing guilt of the ones she couldn't. And then, subtly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. The leopard, despite its overwhelming pain, began to acknowledge her presence in a new way. It wasn't the wary glances of the early days, nor the vacant stare of deep suffering. There were moments now, fleeting but potent, when its eyes, still clouded with agony, would meet hers directly. A prolonged gaze, an almost imperceptible slow blink, a slight tilt of its head as she moved within the hut. These were not the actions of a predator planning its next meal, but something else entirely, a recognition, a fragile thread of connection spanning the cultural chasm and the species divide. This nascent trust, this unspoken acknowledgement, was a powerful affirmation for Sarah. It deepened her resolve, transforming her desperation into a fierce, unwavering determination. She knew, with an absolute certainty that defied logic and disregarded warnings, that she could not, would not, abandon this creature. The window, that simple rectangular opening, had become a portal to a profound, desperate bond, and Sarah was ready to step through it, whatever the cost. The silent acknowledgement from the leopard solidified Sarah's commitment, transforming her quiet vigil into a fierce determination. But as the days bled into weeks, The fragile peace around her hut began to fracture under the weight of growing apprehension within the village. Whispers, initially faint and easily dismissed, swelled into a chorus of concern. News of the wounded leopard, a majestic but clearly ailing predator lingering unusually close to human dwellings, had permeated every corner of the small community. Some villagers, particularly the older generation, viewed its prolonged presence as an ominous sign, a disruption of the natural order. Others, more pragmatic, feared the very real threat it could pose to their meager livestock, especially as its condition worsened and hunting became an impossible task for the weakened creature. The most chilling concerns revolved around the safety of their children, who often played at the edge of the village, oblivious to the unseen dangers lurking just beyond the familiar paths. Pressure began to mount, an unspoken expectation settling heavily on Sarah's shoulders. The elders, though still respectful of her, started dropping increasingly pointed suggestions during their infrequent conversations. The leopard needed to be driven away, they implied, or perhaps, heartbreakingly, nature simply had to take its course, a difficult but necessary truth in their harsh world. Her Western sensibilities, her ingrained belief in intervention where suffering could be alleviated, clashed violently with their ancient wisdom. She felt the weight of their gaze, the unspoken plea for her to resolve this unsettling situation, to restore the balance that her unusual guest had disrupted. This profound connection she felt with the leopard, this relentless urge to save, was not born solely of her conservationist training. It was deeply rooted in a wound of her own, a long-buried trauma that resurfaced with every pained glance from the feline eyes. Flashbacks, stark and unbidden, often assailed her during the quiet moments at the window. She saw the fragile, emaciated form of a young gorilla, caught in a poacher's snare, its mother already gone. Sarah had been a young field biologist then, brimming with idealistic fervor, but ultimately powerless against the forces of bureaucracy and the brutal realities of the wild. She remembered the desperate, pleading look in its eyes as it succumbed, the way its small hand had twitched in hers just before the life left it. And before that, the ghost of a different face, a human face, a close friend lost to a preventable accident, a moment when Sarah felt utterly helpless, unable to alter a tragic trajectory. Each memory, each failure to save, had left an indelible mark, a desperate need to rewrite the narrative of helplessness. This leopard, this beautiful, broken creature, had become a crucible for all that unresolved grief and lingering guilt. She couldn't fail again. She simply couldn't. The mounting pressure and her own internal demons pushed Sarah to a precipice. The leopard's infection was visibly spreading, its breathing becoming shallow and labored. Time was running out. She knew she had to act, warnings be damned. Driven by a desperate impulse, Sarah began to formulate a daring, dangerous plan. She had a small emergency medical kit, a relic from her field days, containing broad-spectrum antibiotics and potent painkillers. The challenge wasn't acquiring the medication, but administering it. Directly approaching a wounded predator was suicide. With painstaking care, Sarah mashed a strong painkiller tablet into a fine powder, mixing it with a small amount of raw meat she had managed to procure. The scent of the meat, though slight, was still appealing. She placed the small offering just outside her window, hoping the leopard's instincts, dulled by pain and hunger, would overcome its natural wariness. Hours passed. The leopard watched the offering with a mixture of suspicion and desperate craving. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Finally, with exquisite slowness, the magnificent creature lowered its head. Its gaze flickered to Sarah, then back to the meat. A tremor ran through its emaciated frame. It took a tentative lick, then another, and then with a gulp swallowed a small portion. Sarah barely dared to breathe. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A desperate measure, certainly, but in her mind, it was the only measure left. The tenuous bond forming between Sarah and the leopard was not without its external pressures, however. A particularly grizzled local hunter, a man named Kwesi, known for his keen eye and even keener sense of tradition, approached Sarah's hut one sweltering afternoon. His face was etched with concern, his tone firm but respectful. Kwesi had heard the whispers, seen the leopard himself, and understood the danger a wounded predator posed to their tranquil village. He suggested with a heavy heart that if the leopard's condition prevented it from moving on soon, a tracking party would need to be assembled to put an end to its suffering, and more importantly, to mitigate any potential threat to their livestock, and God forbid, their children. This proposal struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow, a direct threat to her unspoken mission, a stark reminder of the brutal realities of the wild that she so desperately wanted to soften. She tried to explain her growing connection, the leopard's unusual behavior, but her words felt thin and unconvincing against Kwesi's pragmatic logic. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering, and promised to give it a few more days, but no longer. The ultimatum from Kwesi hung heavy in the air, a sword of Damocles over their fragile understanding. Yet, amidst the rising tension, a flicker of hope ignited. The painkillers Sarah had so cautiously administered, mixed subtly into the meat offerings, seemed to be working. The initial skepticism she felt began to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism. The leopard, though still suffering, displayed subtle but significant signs of improvement. Its movements, once agonized and stiff, were now slightly more fluid. It shifted its position at the window with less visible effort, and crucially, its eyes, while still holding the depth of its pain, seemed to possess a little more light, a hint of its former vitality. This small victory, this tiny concession from the edge of despair, fueled Sarah's determination like nothing else could have. It was proof that her intuition wasn't entirely misplaced, that intervention, however unorthodox, might indeed make a difference. The brief moments of relief the leopard experienced were enough to solidify her resolve. She absolutely had to find a way to save it. The pressure mounted. Kwesi's implied deadline loomed large, and the prospect of the villagers taking matters into their own hands spurred Sarah into action. She knew she couldn't tackle this alone, not with the limited resources and expertise available in the remote village. Against her ingrained instincts for self-reliance, Sarah made a difficult decision. She pulled out her satellite phone, a rarely used lifeline to her old life, and discreetly composed a message. She reached out to Dr. Eleanor Vance, a renowned wildlife veterinarian and an old colleague from her days with a major conservation NGO in the States. Eleanor was a brilliant, no-nonsense professional, precisely the kind of person who would understand the urgency and perhaps, just perhaps, the sheer audacity of Sarah's situation. In a concise, almost clinical message, Sarah explained the highly unusual circumstances. A wounded leopard, its unwavering presence outside her window, the growing trust, the village's understandable fear, and her desperate need for expert guidance. She omitted the more emotional elements, focusing on the factual observations and the medical needs, knowing Eleanor would appreciate the directness, the lack of proper equipment, the remote location, the inherent dangers of sedating a large, wild predator. All these challenges she laid out plainly. She knew Eleanor would initially think she had lost her mind, but she also trusted Eleanor's deep commitment to animal welfare and her innovative problem-solving skills. Sarah knew that intervention was no longer just an option. It was her only path forward, and Eleanor was her best, perhaps her only, chance. She sent the message into the vast digital ether, then waited, a knot of anxiety and hope tightening in her chest. The fate of the beautiful wounded creature now rested not only on Sarah's shoulders, but also on the response of a colleague thousands of miles away, a plea for help echoing across continents, hoping it would not fall on deaf ears. The fragile thread of connection Sarah felt with the leopard was about to be tested as external pressures mounted. One sweltering afternoon, Elder Kofi, his face etched with a mixture of concern and weariness, approached her hut. His voice, usually a comforting rumble, carried an undeniable gravity. He spoke of the community's mounting fear, the whispers among the women, the anxious glances at their children playing near the forest edge. He explained, not unkindly, that while they respected her compassion, the presence of such a wounded predator posed an unacceptable risk. Livestock had been agitated, and a child had reportedly seen the leopard closer to the village boundary than ever before. There was a palpable tension in the air, a quiet urgency that suggested their patience was wearing thin. "Sarah," he began, his eyes unwavering, "we understand your heart, but the wild must remain wild, and the village safe. This animal, it is now a problem we cannot ignore." He made it clear that while they had given her time out of respect for her unusual attachment, a resolution was now imperative. He gave her a deadline, a finite number of days to either convince the leopard to leave, or they would be forced to take measures to ensure the village's safety. The implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken but understood. If the leopard did not depart, the hunters would be dispatched. Sarah's heart sank, a cold dread washing over her. The deadline felt like a cruel irony, just as she felt she was making progress. Desperate, Sarah retreated into the quiet solace of her hut, her mind racing. The counsel from her old colleague, Dr. Aris Thorne, a renowned wildlife veterinarian she had contacted via a satellite phone she kept hidden for emergencies, echoed in her thoughts. He had listened to her frantic, whispered account with a blend of professional skepticism and genuine concern. Aris had been firm about the immense risks involved, emphasizing the unpredictable nature of large carnivores, even injured ones. However, he also admitted that if Sarah had truly established a level of trust, and if the leopard's condition was as dire as she described, a delicate, highly controlled intervention might be possible. He'd meticulously outlined the procedures, the necessary sedatives, the surgical tools, the strict safety protocols that would need to be in place. Then came the offer that was both a lifeline and a terrifying prospect. If Sarah could secure local support, ensuring his safety and that of the village, he would fly out. The logistical nightmare of such an undertaking in this remote location was daunting, but Aris's willingness to even consider it was a glimmer of hope. The village elder's ultimatum, combined with Aris's complex conditions, pressed down on Sarah like a physical weight. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, but Sarah barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed on the window, where the leopard lay, its breathing shallow, its eyes glazed with pain. It was clearly worse. The earlier subtle signs of improvement from the painkillers had faded, replaced by an acute suffering that twisted its powerful frame. It stirred restlessly, a low, guttural moan escaping its throat, a sound that tore at Sarah's very soul. And then, in a moment that felt both inevitable and utterly surreal. The leopard, with immense effort, shifted its position. It wasn't the usual slow recline. This time it seemed to gather every ounce of its remaining strength, and with a pained grunt, actually moved away from the window, turning its head slightly towards the hut's entrance, as if seeking an impossible sanctuary. It was a profound, heartbreaking display of raw vulnerability, a silent plea. Sarah, watching this agonizing struggle, felt an overwhelming surge of empathy, a connection so deep it transcended all reason, all warnings, all fear. The elder's deadline, Eris's cautious advice, the very real danger, all faded into the background. There was only the leopard, its suffering echoing her own unaddressed traumas, its quiet desperation mirroring her own deep-seated need to heal. Her hand, almost on its own accord, reached out. With a soft click, the simple wooden latch released. The window, that barrier between their worlds, the silent spectator to their strange, unfolding bond, swung open slightly, just enough to reveal the deepening shadows within her hut. It was an unspoken invitation, a reckless, hopeful act born of desperation and an unshakable belief in the power of connection. The threshold had been crossed, not by foot, but by an open pain, an act of faith in a world that often demanded only logic. The scent of raw earth and wild animal immediately permeated the air as the window creaked open, a small yet profound gateway between two worlds. The leopard, its magnificent frame racked with pain, lay motionless for what felt like an eternity, its golden eyes fixed on the dark aperture. Sarah held her breath, every fiber of her being attuned to the creature's next move, her own heart thundering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second an hour, each minute a lifetime. The air grew heavy with anticipation, thick with the unspoken question of whether the leopard would truly accept this impossible invitation, whether its desperate plea for help would override its primal instinct of self-preservation. Then, with an almost imperceptible tremor, the leopard began to stir. A low, ragged sigh escaped its throat, a sound of profound exhaustion. Slowly, agonizingly, it pulled itself forward, dragging its injured leg with a visible wince. Each movement was a Herculean effort, a testament to its will to survive. It was a dance of pain and trust, performed in the encroaching twilight. Its powerful head, usually held high with fierce pride, dipped low, almost brushing the ground as it eased its body through the narrow window frame. The rough wood scraped against its fur, but the leopard made no sound, no protest, only a determined, almost glacial push towards the sanctuary Sarah offered. Finally, with a soft thud that echoed loudly in the small hut, the leopard was inside. It didn't try to stand, didn't explore its new surroundings. Instead, it collapsed in a heap, its breathing shallow and rapid, its body trembling uncontrollably. Its eyes, still fixed on Sarah, held a profound, ancient weariness, but beneath that, a flicker of something new. Acceptance, perhaps even a hint of gratitude. This was the ultimate act of trust, a creature of the wild, abandoning all caution, all instinct, to place its fragile life in the hands of a human. Sarah felt an overwhelming wave of emotion wash over her. Fear, yes, but also a fierce protectiveness, a deep, primal connection that transcended anything she had ever known. She moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to spook the already terrified animal, her hand hovering near its head, a silent promise of aid. Outside, the first rays of dawn were just breaking, painting the horizon in soft hues of rose and gold. The village elder, drawn by an inexplicable feeling of unease and curiosity, had approached Sarah's hut just as the leopard completed its agonizing entry. He watched, hidden by the shadows of a nearby acacia tree, as the magnificent wounded beast finally surrendered to its pain within the small, humble dwelling. His stern gaze, usually unwavering, softened imperceptibly. He had seen many strange things in his long life, but never such a profound display of interspecies trust, never such raw empathy from a foreigner. His mind, steeped in generations of traditional wisdom, began to shift. This was not a mere animal, nor a reckless human. This was something sacred, something imbued with a spirit of its own, guided by forces he could not fully comprehend. He emerged from the shadows, his face still etched with the weariness of a long night, but his eyes holding a new resolve. Standing before Sarah's hut, he spoke in a low, resonant voice that carried the weight of his years, a voice that had once condemned her actions. "The spirits have spoken, Sarah," he said, his gaze sweeping over the hut, then back to her. "This creature, it chooses you. My people will help. Send word to your healer. He will be protected." Within hours, the impossible began to unfold. Sarah, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and relief, contacted Aris via satellite. The village elder, true to his word, had quickly mobilized the community. A makeshift landing strip was cleared on a dusty plateau. Local trackers were dispatched to ensure the area was secure, and a deep reverence replaced the earlier fear and skepticism. The sheer logistics were a nightmare, but the communal will, spurred by the elders' newfound conviction, was immense. Aris, astonished but utterly professional, managed to secure a private charter. The familiar drone of a small aircraft soon disturbed the morning calm. The plane, a white speck against the vast African sky, landed clumsily on the improvised strip. From it emerged Sarah's colleague, Dr. Aris Thorne, a man whose calm demeanor belied his extraordinary skills. He carried specialized equipment, a portable anesthesia machine, sterile surgical tools, a range of potent antibiotics, and, most crucially, a deep understanding of animal physiology. He moved with a quiet urgency, his eyes taking in the scene. The small hut, the hushed village, and the palpable tension in the air. Time was of the essence. The focus now shifted, intense and precise, to the delicate process of sedating and treating the leopard within the confines of Sarah's small earthen hut. A race against the fading light and the animal's rapidly deteriorating condition. The open window, a silent promise, beckoned for endless hours as the injured leopard lay motionless, its labored breathing the only sound breaking the evening stillness. Sarah remained equally still, her heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs, every nerve tuned to the creature outside. Then, as the first pale light of dawn began to paint the distant horizon, a flicker of movement. The leopard, with agonizing slowness, began to pull its massive frame forward. It was a testament to sheer will, each twitch of muscle a battle against excruciating pain. Inch by agonizing inch, it dragged itself through the small opening, its body scraping softly against the rough wooden frame. It didn't stalk or leap. It stumbled, collapsing just inside the threshold of Sarah's hut, a heap of muscle and bone, exhausted and utterly vulnerable. The raw trust displayed in that single, profound act brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She knelt beside it, her hand shaking as she dared to lightly touch the coarse fur, a silent pledge of protection. News traveled fast in the village, carried on the whispers of the early morning breeze. The elder, alerted by a young boy who had witnessed the leopard's entry from a distance, arrived at Sarah's hut, his face etched with a complex mix of apprehension and awe. He saw not just a wild beast, but a creature that had chosen sanctuary, a choice Sarah had facilitated with reckless bravery. His initial skepticism about Sarah's methods transformed into a grudging respect, then a profound understanding. The ancient wisdom of his people, which spoke of respecting the natural order, now also acknowledged a rare exception, a bridge built between species. He nodded, a solemn gesture that carried immense weight. The veterinarian would be welcomed. The village would provide whatever assistance they could, ensuring Aris's safety and supporting Sarah's extraordinary endeavor. Later that morning, the drone of a small bush plane materialized from the vast African sky, a sound usually associated with distant towns, not their remote village. Aris, a pragmatic man with keen, intelligent eyes, emerged carrying a sturdy case filled with an array of medical tools. Once inside Sarah's small hut, the atmosphere was thick with tension and purpose. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his years of experience evident in every precise movement. The leopard, weakened but still a powerful predator, was carefully sedated. It was a perilous dance, a calculated risk, but the animal's profound exhaustion made the process slightly less volatile. Aris worked swiftly, his brow furrowed in concentration. He meticulously cleaned the festering wound, revealing the true culprit, a jagged fragment of a poacher's snare, deeply embedded and infected. It was a grim reminder of the senseless cruelty that so often marred the wild. With practiced hands, he removed the fragment, irrigated the wound thoroughly, and administered a potent cocktail of antibiotics and long-lasting painkillers. The urgency was palpable, a race against the insidious infection that threatened the magnificent animal's life. The recovery was not instantaneous. It was a slow, arduous journey that stretched over several weeks. Sarah transformed into a dedicated nurse, her hut becoming a temporary infirmary. She administered medication, changed dressings, and offered small, carefully prepared portions of meat and water. The leopard, initially lethargic and wary, gradually regained its strength. Its eyes, once clouded with pain, began to shimmer with a familiar wild intelligence. There were moments of frustration, moments of fear, but Sarah never wavered. The villagers, once apprehensive, now brought offerings of fresh meat, their initial disapproval replaced by a quiet, collective admiration for Sarah's unwavering commitment. The elder frequently visited, observing the slowly healing leopard and conversing with Sarah, sharing stories of the land and its creatures, a quiet bond forming between them. Finally, the day came for the leopard's release. It was a morning tinged with both sadness and profound joy. The animal, now lean and powerful, its coat gleaming, its movements fluid and strong, paced restlessly within the confines of the hut. The open window, the same threshold it had hesitantly crossed weeks ago, now offered a path to freedom. Sarah opened it wide, her heart heavy but resolute. With a silent, almost imperceptible nod, the leopard strode purposefully out, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its spotted fur. It paused at the edge of the clearing, turning its head. Its gaze, primal and ancient, met Sarah's. It wasn't a human emotion, but there was an unmistakable acknowledgement, a silent farewell, a shared history woven into that fleeting glance. Then, with a flick of its tail, it disappeared into the dense green embrace of the African bush, a ghost returning to its rightful realm. Sarah stood there for a long time, the silence of the empty hut a stark contrast to the weeks of gentle growls and rustling. A profound sense of peace settled over her, deeper and more complete than anything she had felt in years. The wound within her, the one that had festered from past failures, had finally begun to heal alongside the leopard's. She had not only saved a life but had rediscovered her own purpose. a purpose inextricably linked to the wild heart of this land and the unexpected compassion of its people. Her connection to nature, to the community that had ultimately supported her, felt renewed, fortified. This wasn't just another successful conservation effort. It was a testament to empathy, to patience, to the extraordinary bonds that could form in the most unexpected of places. For more inspiring tales of human-animal connection and the challenges we face in protecting our planet's precious wildlife, remember to subscribe and join our growing community. Share your thoughts on Sarah's incredible journey in the comments below, and stay tuned for our next video, where we'll explore another fascinating conservation challenge.